Welcome back. I suppose what I want to probe just with you in a moment is, let's assume that there's a breakdown because the legislature doesn't hold the executives. I mean, notwithstanding what Dr. Mosthekga take his point, but assuming that he's wrong. It's clear that things are going to the judiciary that in other societies might well be dealt with by a legislature in relation to an executive. Doesn't that inevitably is exactly why we've had such terrible tensions between the judiciary and the executive and legislature in the past? I mean, let's not kid ourselves. A very beloved and distinguished Chief Justice like Chief Justice Langa was really assailed by all sorts of people in the most disgraceful fashion. And isn't that because those tensions will inevitably arise if the judiciary is brought in more and more to these disputes?
I think so,
Dennis. The judiciary, therefore, like, damned if it does and damned if it doesn't.
Yes, because of course when the dispute is ripe and it comes before the courts, they have no choice but to adjudicate on them. And I think that this does go to the heart of a bigger conversation around accountability, around the role of Parliament, around committees, around all the many ways in which the legislature ought to exercise oversight over the executive, whether it's through question time in the House, either written or oral questions, the President coming before Parliament and not only answering questions but answering them in a way which is substantive. We haven't really seen that. Very often ministers and the President give very scant responses, and I think all of that is about whether Parliament is able to in fact flex its muscles. And Dr. Mosthekga says that what Gwedi Montage says doesn't matter because it's outside in some political realm. I don't agree with that because I think Parliament is a fundamentally political realm. Whether we like to know it or not, the electoral system means that the members of Parliament are accountable first and foremost really to their parties. We've seen that in the arms deal.
Well, in which case then in fact the system is operating as per design.
Well, one could say that, and there's a big debate about whether the electoral system should change. But of course, if you had Parliament flexing its muscles, for example, I think there is space on this ad hoc committee in Nkandla, for instance, for members of Parliament to do that. They've simply from the beginning seemed to have closed down the debate. I think the opposition parties put forward very cogent, intelligent arguments about the Constitution and its authority, simply ignored by the ANC knowing that they're going to use their majority to push through what I predict would be a weak version of Public Protector's report.
Premier, inevitably, this is going to reach an impasse and it'll go to the courts. And then somebody's going to get very cross.
Well, of course people get cross in a democracy.
One party is going to get cross with the courts.
Of course
Either your lot or the other lot. And judges then find themselves in a position where they're trying to preserve a fragile legitimacy because we're only 20 years into democracy. We're not yet 200 or 300 years. It's fragile.
But
and you're asking judges to do an incredible amount of heavy lifting to save the political system.
You know, every single instrument of accountability is unpopular one way or the other at a particular time. Now, a constitutional democracy is an intricate interweaving of mechanisms of accountability. The media, the judiciary, the Chapter 9 institutions, Parliament, and I can name it, different spheres of government, all of them are accountability mechanisms in a constitutional democracy. The biggest accountability mechanism of all is the voters. Now, for example, when you find the voters in Gauteng saying, we don't like e-tolls, and we will vote out a party that is insisting on e-tolls, then you get voters doing what voters do in all developed democracies, and that is hold the party to account. And the courts, I think quite rightly on that issue, said this is an issue for the voters to sort out, not the courts.
Precisely, because look what happened there. The judge at first instance gives an interdict. And then the government comes back and says, do you know how much this is going to cost? You've never figured this out. This is going to cost something like 250 million rand in lost interest over a year. That means we'll have less housing, less, etc., what it may be. What he was saying, what the Constitutional Court said, there are cases here that are just not suitable for adjudication.
Well, what he was saying was that if a government is elected into office, they have a right to make certain decisions about how to spend the budget. If the voters don't like it, they must vote them out.
Yeah, but you'd be horrified as the Premier in a delicate situation with your budget to suddenly find the courts poking their nose into your budget and saying, sorry, this is, and you saying, well, now how am I supposed to give them the housing that I promised them?
That's exactly why the court said It's for the politicians to take a decision how to spend the budget. They did not intervene in that case.
The Constitutional Court got it right, but the judge in the High Court did exactly the opposite, which is the danger of what occurs.
But the thing is that in the end, I have confidence in our judiciary to get the doctrines right and to establish the precedents. And let me say one more thing to you.
Yeah.
Today in the newspaper, we read that Jacob Zuma is now going to refuse to answer questions in Parliament, although even Chief Whip Mosthekga's own rules say he has to do it at least 4 times a year. He's only done it once this year. And now he says because people are rude to him in question time, he's not coming again. Now, what does that do to the principles of accountability, of transparency, of rationality?
So we're going to be back in the courts on this, I see.
Well, we're going to challenge it first in Parliament through the Rules Committee and say that there's a rule that says this. The President isn't above the rules of Parliament.
Okay.
He's not above the law. He's not above the Constitution.
I don't want to give Dr. Mosthekga a fair chance.
You see, Honorable Zille can't distinguish between political campaign and parliamentary work. For instance,
What does that mean here?
For instance, what she's saying about the voters and the e-tolls, that's in the arena of political campaign. We're talking about Parliament. In Parliament, the problem of the DA and COPE, for instance, was that before we start debating, they say the meeting must stop because there's a constitutional issue which must be resolved by the courts. And they say the meeting must stop because we must go and look for a legal opinion. So they're not using the committee to deliberate. They are using the committee to request the court to intervene. For instance, Comrade Gwede Mantashe, like all political leaders, have the freedom of speech. They can speak. But in Parliament, we are not guided by what the Secretary General says. We are guided by the rules of Parliament. We are guided by the law.
So does that mean, sorry, to cut to the quick, that in this particular case, if the rules say that the President has to come 3 or 4 times to Parliament to answer questions, whatever Mr. Mantashe says, he can say thank you. You will say thank you very much, but we are guided by the rules.
What you must understand is that
simple question.
This non-appearance of the President is informed by the chaos in Parliament, because the matter before Parliament says, are the remedial actions of the public protector binding or not? Whilst we're still debating that issue, the DA and EFF, they bang the tables and say, President, pay, putting the cart before the horse.
Yes, but all I'm asking is, in future, I'm running out of time, I need to ask you this. The question is whether a principle of accountability, which suggests that the President comes before Parliament, I accept that people may be rude, but anybody who's watched Question Time in England will know how rude they are to Prime Ministers. The question is, if the rules say he comes, then he comes, surely.
The President knows the rules very well.
And so
he
comes.
knows that he has to come.
Okay.
But if you have political parties who don't respect the institution,
all right,
who don't respect the head of state,
then what do we do?
Don't respect
we change the rules.
Don't respect the rules of Parliament themselves. We have, as Parliament, to address that disorder.
Okay. What do you say about that?
If we have the head of state who disregards Parliament, the system falls apart. And the President, by not responding timelessly to the Public Protector's report, by the chaos that happened in Parliament was on the 21st of August. And so, that doesn't leave much time for the President to fulfill his question time obligations, which are not, incidentally, Dr. Mosthekga, only about Nkandla. There are many other issues on which the public needs to hear from the President. And that's not going to happen this year, or if it does, it's not going to happen enough. And I think that that's a fundamental problem and starts unpicking some of the arrangements in this Constitution.
That's not a fundamental problem. We have had a short year because of the elections.
Dr. Mosthekga, unfortunately, I have to stop. There were so many other issues I wanted to talk to you about, including the appointment of judges, but I just ran out of time. But this is really very critical, because there's got to be a balance between politics and the judiciary. On the one hand, the argument is that when the Constitution provides for certain rights, parties or citizens in this country can go before the courts and ensure that those rights are clarified so everybody knows how they have to behave. On the other hand, it's suggested that one should exhaust other remedies, parliamentary remedies, and that's not being done. Well, you may. And I'm not suggesting in my summing up that I'm taking sides here. I'm merely posing the question, Premier. Thank you for the heckling. But the point I'm simply making is that the balance between courts on the one hand and politics on the other is not easy either to divine or to define. But that is important because at the end of the day, the legitimacy of all institutions, in particular courts, is actually paramount if our constitutional democracy is not just to survive, but to flourish over the next decade or two. Has it done so? Have we got the balance right? Judge for yourself. Goodbye.